Mauritius' first female president, Dr. Ameenah Gurib-Fakim, recently visited Nigeria as part of her mission to strengthen intra-African trade and foster deeper economic ties with the African diaspora, particularly in the Caribbean. In an exclusive sit-down with correspondent Adesuwa Giwa-Osagie, she shared insight on how Africa can navigate the evolving geopolitical landscape and strategically position itself in a rapidly changing world order. Here's more from that conversation.
In celebrating women leaders, particularly African women leaders, we have a new president in Namibia who's joining the very small club of heads of state in Africa that are women. How do you feel about women leadership currently on the continent?
Well, there's progression. Already, I think we have to congratulate Madam President of Namibia. She's done very well. And I think women walk the talk, because she's appointed nearly 50% of women in her cabinet, and of course in the parliament there's about 50%. Yeah. So it's good to see there's progress. Mind you, things are not so good since we look at what's the big declaration we had in Beijing 2005. There are some good points, but in terms of women leadership, it is still weak. But it's always good to see a woman rising in Africa.
Definitely. And one of the reasons that, one of the things you've been working on since you've left office, I believe, is intra-Africa trade and promoting intra-Africa trade. And I believe also the African Caribbean Investment Forum. Is that what brought you here to Nigeria?
Yes, in fact, I have to thank Aisha Mana for inviting me from Acquire and Consult. And the event is precisely to promote partnership. Of course, the sixth region for the African Union, the diaspora. And we're very pleased to meet up with the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis to be, of course, in Nigeria to see how we can improve trade. Because we mustn't neglect the fact that Africa is 1.4 billion already, heading on to about 2.5 billion very soon. And if you compare this with two giants in Asia, we are looking at two big countries like India and China, and they are at par in terms of population. So we have a huge market, and I think it's only fair that we promote intra-Africa trade. It took Europe over 50 years to get to where it is. Africa, the AFCFTA has been ratified only recently. So far, we are under 20% in terms of intra-Africa trade, so we can look up to Europe, for example, where they are over 75%. So I think there's progress. Yeah. And I think this is a very good thing to have the intra-Africa trade, because we must capitalize on what we have. And what we have is already an internal market.
Yes, but with intra-Africa trade, at under 20%, one of the hindrances is infrastructure and poor infrastructure. Are you working with any of the leaders right now in terms of infrastructure to connect Africa?
The infrastructure deficit, I think, is already in the minds of the leaders. And before the AFCFTA gets, running full speed, I think already we will start at looking at regional integration. And there, if you want to trade with Ghana, Nigeria can trade with Ghana without any problem. Nigeria can trade with Côte d'Ivoire, for example, without any problem. So initially, we look at regional blocks, and then gradually it will merge into. But definitely, infrastructure is one of the challenges that leaders are very keen to address.
I mean, regional blocks are very important, but we have seen, at least in West Africa with ECOWAS, we've seen 3 countries leave recently for the first time since it was founded. We had Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso leave ECOWAS. So that seems that it might be hindering, trade when we have conflicts also springing up. But also, if we're talking about things that are hindering Africa's development, one of the main things is debt, and the debt to GDP ratio of multiple countries, including yours, Mauritius, I believe, is one of the top 10 in terms of high level of debt to GDP ratio. You were recently in South Africa, I believe, as part of the African Leaders Debt Relief Initiative with former President Obasanjo and also our former Vice President Osinbajo. What is motivating this push by, former African heads of states and even current like Ramaphosa?
You've asked 2 questions here. The first one is the failings of regional integration. But having said this, the Association of Sahelian Countries, the 3 countries, and I think there's tendency to get more into this bloc, already it's democracy within ECOWAS. So it's happening and they're moving according to their own agenda. Maybe history will be kind to these countries for many reasons. And one of the reasons is that if you look at a country like Burkina Faso, a country like Niger, where they have taken over their own resources, I think this is a very strong message to many African countries which are resource-rich and yet cannot make the best of their resources. And this, of course, impacts on the debt. And so they are all interlinked. Now, to come back to the issue of debt, yes, there are many countries which are, of course, drowning in debt. And out of these, there are many African countries. The paradox will have it that many of these African countries drowning in debt, these are African countries which are resource-rich. So I think we have to tease out the paradox and find out as to why this is happening. We know why it's happening. But I think there is an awakening across Africa.
When you say we know what's happening, what do you believe is happening?
Well, for too long, we haven't really been decolonized. And if you look at the financial infrastructure, it is skewed against Africa. It is skewed against developing countries. It is skewed against these very poor countries that need the resources, that need the structural issues that have to be addressed. So these are the issues that we have to tackle because the decolonization is still not complete.
And when we're talking about decolonization, we're also seeing a shift in geopolitics with America's new America First, Trump agenda. And we're also seeing some new relationships form in Africa, particularly in West Africa, but also across the continent. We're seeing more trade with Russia and China. Do you believe that this will be positive for Africa's future, or do you believe that we should focus mostly on intra-Africa trade?
I think African countries must focus on all forms of trade. And China is the biggest trading partner right now as we speak with Africa. Russia is also there. It's a country, it used to be what it used to be before 1991. I think African countries should be open to all countries, to all partners who will work in collaboration, in partnership. And the days when countries used to dictate what Africa should do, I think we are really looking at the dusk of that kind of mindset. So we are looking at a new era, and countries in Africa are now becoming more assertive. In fact, some American president was saying that these new leaders of the Western African state, they are sophisticated leaders. So people can decide what that means. But I think there is increasingly the will now for countries to really take the destiny in their own hands and to move with it. And I think it's high time, because Africa is not a poor continent. Africa has poor people, but Africa contains 30% of the world's resources in terms of mineral wealth. So you cannot be poor when you have so much under your ground. But having said this, there is another richness, other riches that Africa has, which is the youth. And here we're talking about the median age of about 14 in some region. So what that brings to the fold when many regions in the whole world, they are aging. So Africa, by 2050, there will be 1 in 4 African who will be a working age adult. So that's very, very big. I think it's down to our leadership to see how we can leverage this energy to drive our economies.
Definitely, I agree. Now, let's move away from maybe colonial and international meddling in Africa, and let's focus on what you highlighted, the youth of Africa and our it's a resource, as you said, but we are facing issues, 1, with insecurity in different regions in Africa, 2, with education and poverty levels. But 3, when it comes to innovation in this new era in the world, do you think Africa is poised to take advantage?
If you look at 2 sectors, we look at M-Pesa, which has been able to bring unbankable people by virtue of the criteria to be banked. They have brought them into the fold. This is an African invention. Many people don't celebrate it enough. And based on that platform, we come up with M-Copper, which provides energy for so many millions of people, and yet nobody celebrates it. So, and the innovation is happening. And I think what we'll have to do, there was a point when innovation, when development meant development of heavyweight infrastructure. But now we can leapfrog, and countries are precisely doing just that. They are leapfrogging with digital technologies. And my country, we are going full-fledged, full-throated approach towards fintech. And if you look at Africa, it's also happening here. And that will be the next phase where Africa will go. So innovation will not happen right across. It will happen in niche areas. And what we'll have to do is leverage the creativity, the leverage of the talent, we need to leverage the passion of our young people to drive these innovative approaches.
Definitely. Nigeria is also one of those countries that's strong in fintech. I believe we have most of the unicorns are Nigerian companies. So you are right, we have to leapfrog. But if we're also talking about, because you said something and you said that someone said that the new African leaders are sophisticated. And I always love to think about the African leaders of the past and what they had to say. And, we did have our former head of state, Murtala Mohammed, give a very important speech saying that Africa had come of age. And this had to do in response to America meddling in Nigeria or African issues. Now we're seeing that happen again, particularly again with South Africa and the expulsion of the ambassador for the U.S., South Africa's ambassador to the United States. Do you think we're going to see more of this and we're going to see more collaboration from African leaders in terms of, Africa being strong and sophisticated?
I will cite you an adage, increasingly becoming a slogan. The old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born. I think we are at the cusp, and of course, in between, sometimes it gives birth to monsters. I think we are at the cusp of all these changes which is happening.
And so you think the new world is?
The new world is struggling to be born, but it will be born. It's happening. And I think if you look at the movement of the BRICS, and people don't talk about this, but the BRICS GDP has exceeded that of the G7. And if you look at the population, in terms of weight of the population, it's gone way beyond the G7. G7, at the end of the day, what does it mean? It means about 14%. We're still talking about 86% of the population in what is increasingly being derogatory termed the Global South. Yeah. And yet we are the international community. All right? So I think there is change to be brought in the narrative we adopt, we use as well, when we look at the way we expose all the issues that we're talking about. So it's happening, and I'm very confident, and I'm also quite happy to see that within my lifetime, I will be able to see that change.
Well, I'm really glad that you're hopeful. You're definitely giving me hope today, particularly as you spoke about the Global South, because one of the things that is affecting the Global South, as they call it, is energy and climate change, and this idea of the just energy transition and electrifying Africa, right? Access to electricity is necessary in order for us to innovate. Do you believe that these Africa-Caribbean investment forums, for example, or the intra-African, forums, do you believe that that's what's going to take us forward? Because we've seen initiatives such from SE4All and the World Bank with rural electrification.
I will cite one of your giants in this country, Aliko Dangote, last year at UNGA. He says no one will come to save us. So we're going to have to depend on ourselves. Africa has been the victim by virtue of the fact that we only contributed less than 4% to greenhouse gas emission. We are bearing the brunt of, desertification, all the rest of it. But we have no choice. And I increasingly say that Africa is sitting on a lot of fossil, and Africa has to be given that carbon window to grow. And I don't see why other countries, Africa for a start has leveraged all her resources to reach us to the fourth industrial revolution, and yet why Africa should not be benefiting from her resources. Increasingly, I plead for that. The continent is sitting on all the minerals that will ensure the transition to cleaner technology. But having said this, Africa is sitting on carbon, on charcoal, is sitting on oil, and I think Africa should be given that window to actually deploy and use to develop their economies.